Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Spencer Ruchty. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. We are celebrating our 25th year in business. And on behalf of Third Place Books and our partners for tonight's event, Book Passage in California, I'm very pleased to introduce this conversation with Andrew Lipstein and Christine Smallwood. The topic of conversation today is Andrew's wonderful new novel, The Vegan, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Thank you so much for calling in, and to those of you out there, feel free to use the chat window to say hello. Let us know where you're calling in from. Third Place Books and Book Passage both have exciting virtual and in-person programming coming up this fall. Both of our stores actually have the pleasure of hosting such authors as National Book Award winner James McBride and Ross Gay. I'll be posting links to both of our stores' event calendars later, so you can follow us and see what's going on in your neighborhood. As mentioned, the chat window is open at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to use it respectfully tonight. And during the last 15 minutes or so, we will also have time for your questions. So if you have questions for our panelists this evening, please submit those to the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. And a reminder that this event will be recorded, so if you miss anything, we'll be emailing that recording to anyone who registered. And of course, you can order The Vegan from your neighborhood independent bookstore, and every purchase you make truly does support the future of this author series, so thank you. And now some brief introductions. Andrew Lipstein is the author of Last Resort, which is a very good novel about a listless but talented writer who steals the idea for his debut novel from a former acquaintance, and an unbelievable deal is made to cover up the scandal that ensues. It has everything you want in a book about publishing in Brooklyn, including a disastrous book reading at Greenline Bookstore that almost gave me a panic attack reading, and it's been one of my favorite novels of the year ever since. Joining Andrew in conversation is Christine Smallwood, who's the author of the much praised novel, The Life of the Mind, which is out in paperback now from Hogarth. Time magazine called it one of its top 10 fiction books of 2021. Christine is also a frequent literary critic for the New York Review of Books, Harper's, and Book Forum, which is back. Welcome back, Book Forum, and where she has notably written about such writers as Sally Rooney, Sigrid Nunez, Ben Lerner, and as well as a wonderful review on the new translation of Heinrich von Klein. In 2024, Fireflies Press will publish her essay book, La Captive. Andrew's novel, The Vegan, is yet another really intense work of fiction that is so good, it is made to be read and compulsively discussed about a hedge fund that uses machine learning to potentially capture unimaginable wealth in the stock market. Andrew is a deeply psychological writer who will summon your sympathy and your ire, and he creates a world in the novel that is keenly real. The book has received great response from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and NPR. It is a book that only Farrar, Straus and Giroux could have published. Please join me in welcoming tonight Andrew Lipstein and Christine Smallwood to your screen.
Thanks so much for having us, Spencer.
Hi, it's great to be here. Andrew, you're going to start with reading?
I am. I'm going to read a very brief passage that is thankfully doesn't need a lot of context. It's from early in the book. So in this scene, the protagonist, Herschel Caine, and his wife are going to be hosting a dinner party for their new neighbors. May 12th. Franny and I had used the date as shorthand more times than we'd ever admit to the evening's guests. It was, by this point, a code name for our mission, one we'd been planning for months, a feat that would guarantee that our life here in Brooklyn, in Cobble Hill, would be all it needed to be. We would make new friends, best friends in our late 30s. And we would do this by showing our neighbors, Philip and Clara, née Miller, Guggenheim, yes, that one, his great, etc. had founded the museum, that we were not only just as interesting as they were, but fun, good people, married with kids on the way, next year if everything went to plan, which they were shooting for too. An intimate detail revealed on just our second rendezvous a few weeks ago as both couples lounged in the narrow shared courtyard that separated our nearly identical, I found their floor plan on Street Easy, brick townhouses. The similarities were uncanny. Jewish husband, Gentile wife, none of us actually religious. We bought our homes within 2 months of each other. Franny, a furniture designer, Clara, an interior designer. Husbands runners, wives in book clubs, both couples shopped at Trader Joe's despite being rich. Even our differences were complementary. Outside the office, there was nothing I liked talking about less than finance, and Philip was a film director and actor, but only in his own movies. My secret, I don't even think Franny knew this, dream profession. And their dynamic perfectly counterbalanced ours. Whereas Franny was our chief executive officer, it was clear from the first time we met that Clara was beta to Philip's alpha. It wasn't so much that there was an imbalance between them, just that their personalities produced a natural equilibrium. Philip was the consonants, establishing order, setting terms, and Clara the vowels, sliding through the indeterminate middle, applying her apparent vagaries to a neatly prescribed life. For the past few weeks, when we saw that they were outside, we would come up with an excuse to join them, claiming that the gardeners didn't water the lilies enough, but we were happy to do it, or noting that it was the only hour of the day when our thin patch got direct sun. We clicked, there was no denying it, but their social life seemed more than full, practically a dinner party a week, it appeared, and we wanted to be much more than casual acquaintances. We needed to impress them. May 12th was also, not by coincidence, the night we were having over Franny's freshman roommate, Bertie Birdie Barnes, a prominent British playwright, in town under the pretense of the opening of a friend's show, but really because she was finalizing her second divorce and needed something to do, hence the contacting of old, lost connections. Bertie and Franny had been inseparable at Brown for exactly 1 semester. Since then, their relationship had consisted of a phone call every few years, albeit one that lasted half the day. I'd never met her, but had the impression we wouldn't share much common ground. Franny used the term outsized whenever she described her. But this was a perfect opportunity. Kismet. Bertie was the whole package, a posh accent and a dazzling career in the arts. The idea came to Franny and me at the exact same moment. Yes, May 12th would also be the night we'd finally invite Philip and Clara into our home. With Bertie's charm coloring the evening, they would witness firsthand our lives, our taste, Franny's artistry. While they ate, they would sit on her trademark chair, the one featured in Architectural Digest not 6 months ago. Did Clara subscribe? The invitation was delivered offhandedly, as if Franny had just come up with the idea. Yes, Clara had said right away, that would be lovely. Franny gave me the news that night as though she were recounting a special at Paisanos. From then on, we agreed, tacitly, to play it cool.
Awesome. There's so much in that passage that gets at what I love about your writing. There's like the close observation of relationships and money, the status anxiety, the characters who are so self-aware, but also so deluded, who see their lives from the outside. And you always put us in this like really hyper-specific, grounded reality, which I love. It gives such like I think it's part of why the books are so pleasurable to read. They're, the 2 books, Last Resort and The Vegan. So for anybody who hasn't read The Vegan, I thought I would just give like a real quick sketch. And then Andrew, you can fill in anything that I've left out. Is that okay?
That's perfect. I'm sure you'll give
cool.
better summary than I will.
So the main character is this guy, Herschel, who when we meet him, he has a startup where his like genius partner has invented an algorithm that can predict, or a kind of AI that can predict the markets and what the markets are going to do. And they're looking to sort of clinch their final investors, right? Who are going to like give them the startup capital they need for this business. But Herschel, I think we have to say what happens with Bertie, don't we, to be able to have this conversation?
Yeah, it's okay. Pretty early on in the book. So
Okay, so right after what you read at this dinner party, Birdie, their guest, becomes so annoying that Herschel decides to spike her drink with some NyQuil, so that she will leave the party. She'll get tired and leave. But unfortunately for everyone, Birdie winds up hitting her head outside while waiting for an Uber and going into a vegetative coma, which leads Herschel into a spiral of guilt and a kind of radical empathy with animals. And he becomes a vegan, and I don't want to ruin anything else. Is there anything else you think people need to know so we can chat?
No, I think that's perfect. I would just say that it was ZQL, not NyQuil.
Oh, excuse me. Is that a copyright-ish? Is that like a...
Yeah, I don't want the lawyers. I don't want to get. I'm already getting emails from the lawyers, so I don't.
Well, okay. Yeah. So the first thing I want to ask you is just like, there was such a great plot and story, and to be like totally, I'm going to pretend it's just us here talking. I have a really hard time thinking of like plot stuff, and I'm really envious. You seem to have this incredible like facility with plot. So where did this idea come from? Like, how can you tell us the story of how the book came about?
Yeah, it was kind of the what goes into and what comes out of the dinner party that was the first germ, which is kind of an extreme shift in tone. I mean, the dinner party basically starts out as a comedy of manners. There's a lot of levity to it. I feel like readers might even recognize the scene. It almost feels like a set piece, where you have like a lot of sass anxiety and a lot of issues that feel much more superficial, at least compared to what will come out of it. And I just love this idea of like how contrived tone is, and how a scene like that has certain expectations that are really fun to tear to shreds, especially in retrospect, which Herschel, obviously ends up doing when he's thinking about the tragedy and his role in it, and sort of reliving the thoughts that went through his head at the time. And I think we've all had experiences where like maybe we're at a party or we're having fun, and then in retrospect later we realize like how much damage a comment of ours might have done, or just in general like realize that we were lifted by a certain mood. That was basically the germ of like what can happen that can really like create two kind of totally different eras in the book.
Yeah. And like so much of the book seems to me to be about like what it like the sort of human and the limits of the human. Like you have this decision that Herschel makes to spike the drink, which, I don't know if it's a decision or an impulse, but it seems like the kind of thing that maybe an algorithm couldn't predict. That's just like what I'm just going to say that, and you can contradict me. And then you have, like the market, the financial markets, which like what could be a more human creation than that? And yet they kind of acquire a power that seems to exist outside or beyond us. And then of course you have the animals that are like the kind of real like other to the human. But I am curious like how you think about that decision. Like, do you think of it as something that is sort of because that's like the novel germ, right? Like that's the thing that kind of can't be accounted for. Like, why would somebody do this? And he doesn't even like, he'll never know why he does that, right?
Yeah. I think what Herschel's decision and the algorithm have in common is this idea of an intentless crime, and then after the fact, guilt without intent, which is something I think we as humans struggle to deal with. And which is why we have things like that end up feeling as contrived as law, where we totally remove like why someone did something usually. I think it's a really interesting question of having guilt, but not the pure kind of guilt where you are actually sorry for what you did, because it's not like knowing about the fact changed you as a person enough that if you did it again, you wouldn't. And basically his algorithm, and this is also early on in the book, it's basically a black box where, as he's talking to someone he hopes will invest in the company, or someone who is kind of like a lackey for someone who will invest in the company, he's saying that like, economics is called a dismal science because it is sort of zero sum. It involves taking from other people. But when you get to the level of like a quantitative hedge fund or an algorithmic hedge fund, it's not even humans making the decision, and the black box sort of relieves the people who are profiting from the actual intent of the action. And I thought that was just something really interesting. And obviously it's becoming more of a question as AI becomes popular, like this idea of intent and ownership of actions. But yeah, I would say there's a pretty direct link between those two things.
Yeah, and his guilt is interesting too. I mean, the book is exploring that guilt, but it also, to me, the book is about how our guilt can get kind of like free floating and get attached to different things. So like Herschel doesn't actually spend a lot of the book, he's not actually like confronting what he did to Birdie for most of the book. He kind of like takes that guilt and puts it on this other thing, which is animals.
Yeah, free. I love the term free floating, because I think that is a very accurate way to put guilt and a lot of emotions. But that, I think, is completely contradictory to how we actually think about guilt and we think about emotions. I think we think about emotions in a very logical way, like I'm feeling X because of Y, but that's not actually how we operate. And I think like that contradiction is very unsettling, because we like to think that we could describe our lives in a way that is accurate and truthful, but emotions are like so free flowing and they bleed out into so many things that we often don't know why we feel the way we do, let alone do the things we do. But guilt, I feel like, is something, so we feel such a strong reflex to categorize and to put into rational terms, because it is so much more relieving to assume that we know whose fault something is. And there's so many issues more and more today. I think the biggest moral issues of right now are things where we're all sort of at fault, but no one in particular, like inequality and climate change. And, like even something like fast fashion, like if you're buying something from like a fast fashion brand, like, are you at all at fault? Like, I don't think so, unless you are using that fact maybe to redeem virtue or to answer that question we always ask ourselves: am I a good person? But in the end, we do so many things in our life that we do others harm, but because we don't have to take direct responsibility for it, it's okay.
Do you ask yourself that a lot? Am I a good person? Is that a question you ask yourself?
Yeah, definitely. And when I ask myself that question, I always find it useful to consider myself in the third person. And if you've read the book, this will click a little bit. I always try to imagine I'm not me and seeing the situation from afar or describing it to somebody else. And that's I think such a weird, it's almost like an unnatural, it feels super modern, this idea of assessing whether you're a good person by basically going to the third person. I feel like our ancestors 1,000 years ago didn't do this. I felt like morality has sort of been distorted recently to become sort of an entity on its own, where we could ask ourselves, are you a good person? And the answer to that question is basically has one value, like money does. And I think that concept plays itself out, especially when we, as you said before, guilt and associated emotions can be free floating. It can also feel like there's a ledger that two totally distinct actions can both impact. And more concretely, if we do something that we know is sort of bad, or in retrospect is bad, we will often then do something good, as if we could make up for the party that was harmed by that first action by the goodness we have credited ourselves to pay back that first act.
So are you a good person?
I mean, I think the honest answer is like anybody. I'm not a good person. I'm not a bad person. I consistently make moral mistakes, and sometimes I show characteristics of somebody who has good traits and sometimes bad.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You should become a therapist. I wish therapists were this direct.
Yeah. Okay. So I also want to talk to you a little bit about Herschel's radical empathy. I mean, at least I've seen it described as this, because there's also a way, I was looking back at the book today. I read the book back in January, and then today I kind of sped read it. And there's like a way that Herschel is actually just like the most hubristic person, right? Even in his empathy, where like, of course, this guy who's like a hedge fund manager who's trying to be one of the masters of the universe thinks that like he swings from like not caring about animals at all to basically thinking he can read their minds, and like to me that is like that's like not, he's not really ever recognizing the like difference that we have with animals, right? He's either like ignoring them or he's like speaking for it. I just kind of was like curious, like if you wanted to say anything about Herschel and empathy, or like what you're doing with his character in those moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of going back to what I just said, like morality, like money, at best is a means to an end. Like morality in society is used to bind us together. It's used to build trust. It's used to create community. But when it's treated as an end to itself, and you sort of have this like solipsistic, almost greedy attitude towards morality, and it becomes its own end, then you're so myopic you can't even see the actual effect on other people. And because Herschel basically needs to like rebalance his own ledger, he only cares about his own goodness and like how he considers his own goodness, which is totally divorced from what goodness actually does, which is it has an effect on other people.
Right. That makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so I read there was a delightful profile of you that was done in New York Magazine that everyone should read. But the most shocking thing in it is that I learned that you like have a daily writing quota and you just sit down and meet it. So first, I wanted to know like what's that like? And I also wanted to hear you talk a little bit about like how you think that process might influence your books, because like both Last Resort and The Vegan are just like incredible page turners. Like, you can just like sit down and there's all this like forward momentum. They're so propulsive. And when when you talked in that profile about how you just kind of like sit down and you can force yourself to meet a quota, I was like, oh, is that this like forward driving energy that's actually in the writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think setting a quota for yourself can go really wrong in that you're like, the only thing I need to do is produce 1,500 words, and like I'm just going to meet that goal, because of course then what ends up happening is like the words are terrible and not usable. For me, before I get to that point of actually sitting down to start a book, it is about finding an idea, and then along the way the progression of the book that will make me excited enough to want to actually write those words. I mean, in the context of the article, it sounds like I'm like, almost like sadistic towards myself, and like look forward to punishing myself every day. And like, if I don't get a doggy treat or something. Oh, it's sort of like that. But I will say that like with the book that I'm working on now, my word quota like decreased basically by half. And I loved it because it gave me more of an opportunity to be even more excited when I sat down the next day, because when I wasn't writing, I thought more about what I wanted to do the next day, and having enough that it didn't feel painful. And you can feel it. Like some days you hit your quota early and it's because you really loved what you were writing. And other days it's like, it's like when you're in like a class as a teenager and you're staring at the clock and it was like 2:17 and then it's like 2:19, but you thought 20 minutes had passed. You're like, wait, I wrote 25 words. How is that possible? So not all words come the same, but I do really like treating writing like a practice, like work. I think with Last Resort, I believed much more in this concept of like inspiration. Like I really want to like get inspired enough to sit down and write. Whereas like, I think even if the words come slowly, just doing it, forcing yourself to do it will make sure that what's in your brain will come out like when it needs to.
Yeah. So what were the most challenging parts of this book? Like what were the trickiest things for you to figure out?
That's a great question. I think the hardest parts were, I mean, this is sort of maybe a boring answer, but a lot of like the subplot around Ian, who is a kind of like weirdo, creepy I don't know what the right, not certainly not a socialite, but someone who like likes talking about philosophy with like rich men type of person. I actually read a profile of Jeffrey Epstein, and not that he's based on Epstein, but there was this thing with like Epstein and like Dershowitz and like all those guys like really loving like sitting down in a dark wood paneled living room and just like talking about, you know, the big issues. That's just sort of like so repulsive, just to like think that there's a certain like learnedness to it that I think is like common among very rich men. Writing scenes with him because I felt like I had to try really hard to not make him into a caricature of a person, and he's one of the people in the books that I think has the lowest dimension of morality. He's I think sort of clearly a bad actor in the context of the book. So making sure that his character was like equally as full of motive and personality as everybody else, I found I had to put a lot of thought into it.
In your in the acknowledgments in the back of the book, you thank some like CEOs and finance people that you interviewed. Mm-hmm. You don't thank them by name, you just sort of thank them as a group of people you interviewed. I'm curious, like what other, like what kind of research did you do, and how did that research inform?
I interviewed, I think, about 8 quant hedge fund guys. I think 3 or so of them were CEOs. And I spent like a summer, like maybe 3 months, just reading books about that world and interviewing people like that. And it was deeply influential. I am very attracted to that world, but I didn't feel comfortable enough writing in it, both like on a technical level, nor did I feel like I could create a character who I knew would be somewhat truthful. And those conversations really varied as far as like how personal they were. Some of them were like, you know, the guys were like very wary, like making sure over and over this wasn't on the record and blah, blah, blah. And then a couple of them were like very disarmingly vulnerable about morality and about how they perceive themselves and their effect on other people. And, you know, for a book about a hedge fund guy, and of course, like coming to a novel where the protagonist is a hedge fund guy, we're sort of ready to assume he has great moral deficits. I really wanted to locate the goodness in somebody who so ambitiously pursues money on its own right. And I really needed those conversations. I basically researched the book for as long as it took me to write the first draft.
So like, where is the goodness? Those guys.
Well, I think what's interesting about talking to people who are making money from money is it's not a moral question of whether this is right. It's sort of like an axiom in their world. They view making money as, I think any of us view our job as, like, we have goals, we have things that hold us back, but we know directionally exactly where we need to be. But I think so they don't, I don't think, like any of us do, ask ourselves deep moral questions about what we're doing. You know, if you work for a company, even if it's like a publication, you can go up the ladder and see who owns that publication. Or even if you're pursuing art and maybe it's more pure sense, thinking about the negative effect it might have on people or the people you have used in that book. Or I mean, I think creating art is, you know, sort of ultimately a selfish act. It could be seen like that. I think whatever you're doing, you have to ignore while you're doing it the negatives of it, but you're still always a person. And I think the biggest moral implications you have is how you interact with the people around you. And the biggest moral, I don't know if I'd call it a moral. I spoke to one guy who had a sort of big moral epiphany, and it had to do with the way that he influenced those people around him. And I think no matter what you do, we're always super tuned into our effect on other people, even if we can't admit it to ourselves in the moment. And that business, like many businesses, is a people business.
So I'm curious, a slightly different question. Well, one, this is kind of a digression, but I really need to ask it. I don't want to run out of time. Has Joanna Hogg read the book? Does she know about it?
So Christine is asking that because Herschel was sort of inspired to spike Birdie's drink with ZzzQuil because he remembers this movie of Joanna Hogg's where somebody is like so bored by a dinner that they pretend to pass out in order basically to leave the party. Would you say that's an accurate retelling of that movie? Yeah. To answer your question, I have no idea. I mean, I would love it. I don't know how to contact.
I feel like FSG needs to get a copy to Hogg. Okay, and then this is also a sort of, now I'm just going to fire random questions at you, so get ready. I'm curious, like, what you are looking for as a reader. So, like, when you read a novel, whether it's a new novel or an old novel, like, are there certain things that you are looking for, or like, what kinds of books tend to excite you as a reader?
Yeah, I think I can answer that question, I think, quite simply, which is moral ambiguity. And I will say that the books I've read, at least in the past couple of years, that have the most moral ambiguity tend to be nonfiction. And even a lot of them are like business books that if you saw in a bookstore, you would probably, by the cover, you'd probably think like, this is for some 50-year-old guy on the train back, like on the Metro North or NJ Transit. Like books just about like the downfall of Enron or the financial collapse, or there's a great book I think called When Genius Failed about the downfall of long-term capital management. I think those books, and a lot of them are novelistic as far as their portrayals of characters and how in depth they go and how much they talk about desire, have much more moral ambiguity embedded within it than a novel. I think just by dint of the fact that especially modern novelists are very aware of morality to the point that they approach it out of fear.
Do you mean like the fear of being on the, like, quote, wrong side of an issue, that kind of fear?
Yeah, or even the fear of presenting a character who it's left up to the reader what to think about them. One nonfiction book that isn't about finance that I think has more moral ambiguity than any book I've ever read is Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt, which was also, of course, controversial when it came out and is still controversial. But a book like that, where you're in the middle of it and you don't even know what to think morally about any of the characters or even the broader themes, I think is so exciting, and what reading a book to me is most about.
That's such an interesting answer. So another thing I wanted to ask you about, and then some people have posted questions in the chat. If anybody wants to submit more questions, please do that. Otherwise, I will just keep peppering Andrew with questions. So the time period that your book covers is pretty brief, right? And it's like the few days or the week maybe after the incident at the dinner party. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that choice, and, like, because somebody, clearly this is the kind of event that will be haunting, one hopes, this character forever, right? And so, like, why did you want to set us in this kind of compressed time frame? Did you think about that? Or
yeah, well, I think practically, what will end up happening to Herschel is he has this sort of maybe you'd call it an awakening, a very intense fellow feeling with the natural world, and it is ultimately contrived, and I don't think that something like that can last longer, unless it's like, in a way it's kind of like for him, like falling in love, but he's basically falling in love with his own need to avoid coming to terms with what he's done. But yeah, I really felt like the pace of the novel and the sort of intensity I wanted to attach to it worked better. And I think it takes place over, I think, Monday to Sunday. So, yeah.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to ask one of these questions. Okay, so there's a question here. How does a writer make the reader race to the finish line as you have done in The Vegan? I mean, we can like sort of rephrase that any number of ways, but like, I agree with this questioner, Joseph. Like, I think that your work is incredibly propulsive. And is that something you're going for? Like, is that something you want? Is that a value you have? You want the reader to have that experience? Are you thinking about that? Are you thinking about pacing? Is it conscious? Are you just like, no, I'm just like a genius at writing these incredible plots, you know, like.
Definitely don't think I'm a genius. I think it's two things. One is that I am always writing to keep myself entertained and to surprise myself. And on a more practical level and plot wise, I always like to have it that there's no dead ends. There's never like a scene that isn't producing something new or isn't moving characters or their desires. Sometimes I will like really want to write a scene or even a paragraph to play with ideas that I want to, and then I'll realize that it is a dead end, that it's just kind of like I'm going into a room and then I'm exiting the same way I came in. I think a novel succeeds when you're never coming back to where you were before. And maybe, of course, you're not going in a straight line, but you're just constantly moving through new rooms. Which is all, I think, more like instinct than anything conscious or that I'm like planning. But
do you want to say anything more about artificial intelligence and just like what I'm curious, like, I mean, I know you're a math guy, you're like a numbers guy, as well as being a writer and a reader. But yeah, I just want to know, like, are you afraid of AI where we are with it? Like, are you cautious? Are you excited? Are you optimistic? Like, what are you thinking about it?
I mean, I'm definitely scared. I think like many people, when I started this book, it was around the time I also started trading a lot in the market, and it was kind of a heady, even frothy time in the market where there was like a lot of irrationality and a lot of like psychology. This was basically like a year before like the GameStop thing and stuff like that. And it really became apparent to me how much of it is like human decision making, which is to say like flawed decision making, which is an exact area where something like AI would just clean up entirely. I mean, there's already been flash crashes due to algorithmic trading, but when I started this book, I believe that there would be a time when AI made trading a single stock not tenable and something that stops happening, and I still believe that. And I think maybe more people believe that now, but I do think there's going to come a time when our conception of finance is completely done away with because of AI.
And what about other stuff? Are you worried about like, you know, species, like whatever, extinction?
Like, will they kill us?
Yeah, are the AIs going to rise up and kill us?
I don't think so. I mean, those mechanical dogs certainly don't make me sleep soundly, but I don't think that will happen. I think we're more fear of like maybe economic warfare between nations, but
Okay. And okay, speaking of robot dogs, who are your favorite like writers about animals or texts about animals?
So I did read The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram, which is in the book, and which is like a wonderful text. It doesn't it's not really like a nature book in that it is sort of whimsical enough that it's not like reality. It's kind of like a way to retell the story of humanity. I love books about nature. Just before I started this book, I read Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, I think, about mushrooms, which is sort of like a creepy book in its own right, because he sort of paints mushrooms as like halfway between animal and plant. And just the idea of like lending something like fungi decision making is like super disorienting and like the type of thought that we couldn't actually believe, because if we did, we wouldn't like be able to even function or feed ourselves.
It's
Yeah.
really trippy. It
like is.
But where we are with mushrooms is really interesting. Like I can't believe that I only learned about a year ago how important fungi are for trees absorbing
Mhm.
nutrients. Like that was just like, I had this totally distorted idea of how plants exist.
Yeah, they're kind of the middleman
Yeah.
because trees like exchange nutrients, and even before there were roots, there were mushrooms, fungi to act as roots that were like the market makers. They were like, we'll trade you like some sucrose for some like glycerin or whatever.
Well, and they've been totally written out of the story of like my elementary, my like elementary education level knowledge of like how plants grow.
Yeah, completely.
I was shocked when I learned this. Somebody in the chat wants to know, who do you read or listen to for absurdist humor? Do you think that you're a funny writer, Andrew, while we're on the subject?
This feels like a trap. I don't. I'll never say anything positive about myself. At least on video, it'll end up on YouTube. But I definitely don't really like comedic writing. I think like if a book is ever described in the marketing copy as like a romp, which some people describe my first book as, or like funny, that will be like an immediate turnoff for me.
Wow, what about fun? Do you like to have fun?
I think fun is even worse than that. I think fun is basically implying like this book is not like, there's no like ideas in this book. It's like just, I think fun is like a death knell, I think. Absurdist. Yeah, I can't think of a single. I mean, I really loved the novels of Edward St. Aubyn. I wouldn't call him absurdist, but he's I think deeply humorous.
Yeah, he's funny. Dark. Really
dark, yeah.
dark.
But what would be like not dark? What's like a humorous, not dark writer who isn't like Wodehouse?
Yeah, I mean, all the best humor is really dark, I think.
Yeah. For
sure. Okay. Do you want to say, can you tell us what your next novel is about, or are we not allowed to know yet?
Sure. It's very much on my mind because I'm editing right now. It is about an American man and his Danish wife taking their paternity leave in Copenhagen, which might ring true for some people who know me and my family, but it's not based on us. And basically, as they arrive, they find out that the Danish woman's ex is very ill. And basically, I hate to say this, but not everything's as it seems, and things get turned upside down. I would say more broadly, it's about masculinity and authenticity and truth in a bigger sense. It's probably my most plot-heavy novel. There's a big twist, and I'm very excited for it. I believe the title will be Something Rotten.
Yeah, that's cool. I think that something that's interesting about your books or somewhat is that they're really like novels of ideas, but they're also really novels of character and psychology. And I think that's like, it's a hard combination to pull off.
Yeah, I think if you err in the first direction, then things can get pretty insufferable for sure.
Yeah. Are you tired of talking about your own veganism, or?
I'm actually not a vegan.
What? Why did we go to the vegan restaurant that time?
Yeah, so Christine and I had a lunch a few months ago, and I made her go to a vegan restaurant, which I thought was pretty good.
You're not a vegan?
No, I'm a vegetarian. I do enjoy vegan food. I also I like this restaurant. Shout out to Luann's Wild Ginger, because it kind of makes you feel like you're in like a rehab center and on like a super like macro diet, and you're just like kind of like something went off the rails in your life.
Oh man, I feel really betrayed right now. I don't know if I can continue with you.
I never, I mean, we could look at our email exchange. I never portrayed myself as a vegan.
But you were like, let's go to this vegan restaurant. I was like, well, okay, I mean, I guess I should say yes.
You're like, I guess there's no other options. I don't know of any other vegan places.
It's a diet, okay. Okay, so we can't talk about your veganism because it's not true. All right, okay, all right. But you are a vegetarian.
Yeah, I've been a vegetarian for about 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you're going to be a vegetarian forever?
I do think so, yeah. Which my wife would hate to hear. She, both my wife and my son are big carnivores, and she's tried to strike a balance with me where if I eat fish, she'll stop eating meat. But but I don't think I will ever do that again.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody else in this chat have a question? You can feel free to shout it out. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. So we talked about, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my questions here. Guilt, time, animals. Should we talk more about animals? Oh, wait, here's John Hay. Hey, John. John Hay says, is veganism a morally superior position?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think the answer is yes, but I think the question is sort of answering itself by the fact that if you are wondering what a morally superior position is, I think it's really interesting to consider why. And if that alone should be the rubric for making decisions in your life. Like, would it be a morally superior position to, if you have extra money, put it in the bank, or to be a morally superior position to give away any money you have to charity? I feel like we always know the answers to these questions, but the power of our own free will over our life comes in the compromise. I tend to think vegetarianism is like the least morally superior position because at least you have some position. But I think no matter what brings you to vegetarianism, if you really believed in it, then it would take you further down the road to veganism.
Wait, really?
Yeah, I mean, if it's for environment, if it's for animal rights, if it's because you just don't like consuming animals, if it's for your own health, I think all of those reasons, like, you just take a few steps further and that vegetarianism becomes veganism.
Bill says, have you received any feedback from the finance folks you spoke to in the research process to the novel? Do you feel like this book, given the content, has attracted a different reader base than you expected?
I don't have insight into the reader base. I got in touch with all of the guys I interviewed and sent them copies. I haven't heard from them. I mean, I think reading a novel for people in that field is probably a more rare activity. I did get in touch with, I think I forget who it was. It was someone at Renaissance Technologies, which I mentioned in the book, which is like the OG quant firm. And he said something like, we don't have time to read books. Like, don't you know that? Which is funny because it's like a very learned field. Like, a lot of quant funds are basically just like math and physics departments who really want to make a lot of money. But yeah, I would be really interested in that, if this would bring some like some new novel readers into the fold.
Bill says, I'm in that field. I can confirm reading a novel is a rare activity, but have thoroughly enjoyed. Oh, that's so nice.
I want to ask Bill a few questions.
Yeah, maybe Bill can stick around. Okay, an anonymous attendee asks, given what you say in your New York Magazine interview about why you maybe became a vegetarian and your clear, super rational, logical bent, how do you square those two? Okay, so I think I can gloss this question. In the New York interview, you talk about your dad and how he choked on a piece of steak, and that led 2 years later to you becoming a vegetarian. You had a very strong kind of disgust reaction to eating meat, a kind of delayed reaction to it. But this person is saying, but you also come across as being very rational and logical. So how do you?
Can you hear me? I feel like it cut out for a second.
No, I can hear you.
Okay, I guess it was just Christine.
Yeah.
I think the trick to that question is come across. I mean, I am definitely not a super rational person like anybody, and the things that most deeply affect my life, I don't think I have any more control over than anybody else.
That's good. Christine, can you hear me?
I think Christine is deeply frozen.
Deeply frozen. Well, we can continue. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, let's see. Oh, Christine disappeared. she'll be back in a second. But yeah, in the meantime, can you talk about what? So you said you have a third book coming out. What was were you writing The Vegan as you were writing Last Resort, or what order were you writing the books in the order that you published them?
Definitely in the order that I published them. I started The Vegan before Last Resort was published, and basically had a hard deadline of when our son was born in May of 2021 for finishing that. And Last Resort was published in January of 2022. So
yeah. Hey, Christine.
Sorry, guys. I don't know what happened.
No, that's okay.
What did I miss?
Oh, I was just asking about the order in which novels were published, if they're written also in the same order.
That's a good question. Yeah. Did you decide if you're rational or not?
Well, I said that I'm definitely not rational, and maybe I make sometimes rational decisions, but I'm not. My most deeply held beliefs and what I'm swayed by is certainly as human as anybody else.
What are your most deeply held beliefs?
I wish I knew. No, I mean, we actually live near now the restaurant that I became a vegetarian at, and I was having dumplings with my wife, and it was probably the most irrational yet like passionate belief when I looked at the meat and just thought that I didn't want to eat it. And it's one of those decisions that is like totally irrational because you can't put it into words even to yourself. So
yeah, like falling in love or out of love. Bill has another question. Did you do any character research in addition to finance research? Do you have friends like Herschel?
I don't. I think those conversations, were very good for getting characters outside of that world. I also did speak to a vegan activist, I should say, a guy by the name of Sol Eubanks. And, I think there is a stereotype of vegans, obviously, and like all stereotypes, it is a bit flat. But I was really, I loved going back to the rational thing. I loved how rational and able to put into words his decisions were. I always find it interesting to meet and talk to vegans because I feel like the persuasion only goes one way. Like, I don't think anyone ever talks to a vegan kind of like hoping to convince them out of their veganness, but it's always the implicit assumption of like that they're going to like try to convert you or something. And I think it's interesting that like the sway of persuasion always goes in the direction of the person with the highest conviction, because sometimes people who have thought things over more or are more conscious in their decision making are like yielding to compromise more. Yeah.
Andrew, is there anything else you wanted to be asked, or like that you like want to talk about with this book and just like nobody's asking you, or I didn't ask you?
Not many people have. Well, some people have talked about the cover, and which is yeah, that's the cover. Which is very fun and funny for me because these are two anole lizards, and when I was a kid, I had two anoles, and one of them basically killed the other by stealing crickets out of its mouth, and so basically starving their fellow inmate to death. And that's just sort of a fun.
That's why we should eat lizards, right? And like that's the moral argument for us eating lizards.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny that we don't eat, lizards. We don't eat squirrels, but we eat. I won't go down this road, but yeah, it's just a fun fact that this sort of early traumatic part of my childhood ended up on the cover of one of my novels.
Did you but you approved this image?
Yes.
Okay, I guess maybe this will be the last question from the Q&A. Have you ever been recognized on the street because of your profile pics?
I don't think this counts because, well, I'll just say what it is, but last Thursday I went to a book event, and there was an editor I wasn't associated with who recognized me from the New York Magazine piece, but I feel like because she was very much in my world, it doesn't really count.
Doesn't count.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, in case this wasn't clear, that I'm just such an enthusiastic fan of this book. And it's such, I'm sorry, Andrew, I know you don't want to hear this, but it's really fun to read. And I think that people should read it because it's fun and it's smart.
Thank you for hedging fun with smart. I appreciate it.
Yeah, party agree. It's good, just as good as the cover depicts. I was curious, Andrew, about this cover. Did you go through? Were there multiple? Like, did FSG present multiple options to you? Because this depicts, a scene that occurs in the book, and then when you get to that scene, which is apparent here. I mean, it feels there's a lot of weight to it, and I always wonder when books actually have it's not an abstraction, but something very concrete on the cover that takes place in the book. Do you feel like there's a lot of weight then on that scene that you did or didn't intend?
Yeah, it's funny about that. I did get a few options, and it's always funny getting options because it really makes you realize how much a cover can change a book.
Yeah,
because you get options that are kind of very tonally different, and you already feel how differently somebody would come to the book if they were presented with a different cover.
Right.
And like for my first book, the scene it depicted, I then worked back into the book because it's a book about a book, and the cover is like a picture of a cover.
A picture of a cover. Yeah,
exactly.
Right here.
So after
see, like this kind of a smudging, there's like
you can see the faint outline.
It looks as if you, yeah.
I like wrote that back into the book, but I think it's really fun how much emphasis the cover puts on that part of the book. It is an important part of the book, but there's also like a lot of randomness that goes into what ends up being the image of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Christine. That's all we have time for today. Go exchange currency for goods at your local neighborhood bookstore for the vegan. And of course, Christine's book is The Life of the Mind, out in paperback from Hogarth. Thank you both for joining us tonight on behalf of Third Place Books and Book Passage. And thank you, everyone who's out there listening, and please be well.
Thanks so much, Spencer.
Take care.